Imagine this: a man, aged but wise, living in the bustling city of Ur. This place, Ur of the Chaldeans, was no small town. It was a center of trade, filled with people, customs, and idols of all kinds. Here, surrounded by the comforts of a settled life, lived a man named Abram. He had a wife, Sarai, who was known for her grace, but together they carried a heavy burden. She was unable to have children. Life in Ur seemed predictable for Abram, but deep inside, he felt a restless stirring, as if the divine winds were blowing, guiding him towards something greater. And then, one day, that call came. A call that would not only change his life but alter the course of history itself. The voice of God reached Abram, and it wasn't just any voice. It was clear, commanding, yet filled with promise. "Leave your country, your people, and your father's household, and go to the land I will show you," God said. The promise continued, "I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all peoples on earth will be blessed through you." Now imagine hearing such a call. Would you leave everything you've ever known, the comfort, the familiarity, the security? But Abram wasn't just an ordinary man. He was a man of profound faith. He didn't hesitate, didn't question. Instead, he took this divine command to heart, even though it meant walking away from the city he knew, the friends he had, and the life he had built. He believed in a promise that was as yet unseen. So, Abram gathered his family, Sarai, his nephew Lot, and all their servants and possessions, and they set out on a journey towards an unknown land, leaving behind the rich city of Ur. It was a journey of faith, with no maps, no clear destination, only a promise guiding their every step. As they left Ur's towering ziggurats behind, the desert stretched out before them, vast, uncharted, intimidating. Days turned into weeks and weeks into months. As they wandered, Abram's faith was tested by the uncertainty of the road. But each night, under the canopy of stars, he held on to the promise, trusting that God's words were true. And there was something about those nights, something about the endless stretch of the sky, filled with stars like unspoken promises, that gave Abram hope. Perhaps it was during those quiet moments that Abram began to understand that his journey was about more than just reaching a physical destination. It was about trust, about leaving behind the old ways and embracing a new, divine vision for his life. And so, from that moment on, Abram's life took on a new rhythm, a rhythm of faith, of obedience, and of listening to the voice that had called him out of Ur. Little did he know that his decision to follow would set the stage for a story that would echo through the ages, influencing not just his descendants but all the nations of the earth. His obedience to that call made him the father of a people and the cornerstone of a promise that would reach beyond his lifetime. So, as the dust of the desert swirled around their caravan, Abram moved forward, step by faithful step, into the unknown, carrying with him the hope of a great nation and the whispers of a future that only God could see. And so, as Abram continued his journey, the road ahead led him into the vast, untamed lands of Canaan. With each step, the weight of the divine promise lingered in his thoughts. He couldn't see the future that God had described to him, but his trust was like a flame, steady, unwavering. In the distance, the hills of Canaan rose, unfamiliar and wild. But instead of uncertainty, Abram saw potential, a land that held the seeds of a new beginning. He built altars there, not as a sign of possession, but as a testament to the God who had guided him out of Ur. These altars were markers, places where the earthly and the divine met, and where Abram would call upon the name of the Lord, seeking reassurance that this unknown land was truly part of the promise. Yet, the reality of his situation was hard to ignore. Sarai, still unable to bear a child, watched as the years passed by. She felt the promise of God like a shadow, always present but elusive. Abram too must have wondered, gazing into the night sky filled with countless stars, if one day his descendants would be as numerous as those lights above him. And then, God spoke to Abram again, renewing the promise and deepening its significance. One evening, as Abram stood alone, surrounded by the silence of the night, God told him, "Look up at the sky and count the stars. If indeed you can count them, so shall your offspring be." It wasn't just about a nation anymore. It was about a legacy as vast as the sky itself, a future that would stretch beyond human understanding. Abram believed, and his belief was credited to him as righteousness. It was this faith, simple yet profound, that God saw in Abram, an unwavering trust that did not demand evidence, but embraced the unseen. And with that faith, the promise became a covenant, sealed not just with words but with a divine bond. God spoke of the land that stretched from the river of Egypt to the great river, the Euphrates, a territory that Abram's descendants would one day inhabit. Yet, at that moment, all Abram had were promises, barren hills, and a wife whose hope seemed to wane with each passing year. But the promise wasn't just about what could be seen, it was about what was to come, something that lay beyond the reach of human hands. As Abram walked through Canaan, he carried this promise in his heart like a hidden treasure. He wandered among valleys and hills, knowing that this land, which seemed empty and wild, would one day be filled with his descendants. The promise of blessing, that all families of the earth would be touched through him, felt distant. But Abram trusted that somehow, through all the uncertainties and trials, God's words would find their fulfillment. And as the sun set each day, painting the land in shades of gold and crimson, Abram looked beyond the horizon, believing in a future that stretched further than his eyes could see. He believed that through him, a new chapter was unfolding, not just for his own family but for the entire world. A chapter that was still being written, page by page, in the light of those countless stars. But just as Abram began to settle into this rhythm of hope and trust, life in Canaan presented its first challenge. A severe famine swept through the land. The promise of a new future seemed suddenly fragile against the harsh realities of survival. The streams dried up, the fields turned barren, and desperation hung in the air. Abram, feeling the weight of his responsibility to Sarai and those who traveled with him, made a difficult choice. He turned southward, leading his caravan toward the abundance of Egypt, a land known for its wealth and fertile valleys. Egypt was a place of power, with towering structures and a powerful ruler, Pharaoh himself. But as they neared this foreign land, fear began to grip Abram. He knew that Sarai's beauty would draw attention, and he worried that Pharaoh might desire her and, in doing so, might see Abram as an obstacle to be removed. So, he turned to Sarai with a plan that would test both his courage and his integrity. "Say you are my sister," he pleaded, "so that I will be treated well for your sake, and my life will be spared because of you." It was a plan born out of fear, a moment where the promise seemed overshadowed by the immediate dangers of the world. And just as Abram feared, Sarai's beauty captivated the Egyptians. She was taken into Pharaoh's palace, treated as a guest of honor, and in exchange, Pharaoh lavished gifts upon Abram: flocks, herds, servants, and wealth. But while Abram gained materially, his heart must have been heavy with guilt and uncertainty, knowing that Sarai was in a palace not her own, surrounded by people who did not understand the promise that bound them together. It was a decision that revealed Abram's humanity, his vulnerability and his fear, even amidst his great faith. Yet God did not abandon them. Striking Pharaoh's household with plagues, God revealed the truth, showing that Sarai was not merely a sister but the wife of a man chosen by the divine. When Pharaoh discovered the deception, he confronted Abram, asking, "Why did you not tell me she was your wife? Why did you say, 'She is my sister,' so that I took her to be my wife?" With a mix of fear and anger, Pharaoh ordered Abram to leave Egypt, taking Sarai, his possessions, and all that had been given to him. And so, Abram and Sarai departed from Egypt, their hearts heavy but their journey intact. They returned to the land of Canaan with more than they had before, but also with the weight of a lesson learned. That fear, even in the face of the unknown, must be tempered by trust in the promises of God. As they crossed the borders of Canaan once more, Abram looked back at the towering structures of Egypt, realizing that his journey would be filled with such moments. Times when the uncertainties of life would challenge the faith that had led him this far. But with each step back toward the hills of the land God had promised, Abram knew that his story was still unfolding, and the promise, though tested, was as alive as ever. As Abram and Sarai settled back into Canaan, the blessings and challenges of their journey continued to unfold. Their wealth grew, flocks, herds, and servants multiplied, and with them the demands of managing so much. But this abundance came with its own set of challenges, especially between Abram and his nephew, Lot, who had traveled with him from the start. Their camps were side by side, and soon, tensions began to flare. The land could not support both of their growing herds, and disputes broke out between their herdsmen. What had once been a unified family now found itself on the verge of conflict. The arguments over pastureland and water rights grew more frequent, and Abram could see that something had to change before their bond fractured beyond repair. One morning, as the sun climbed over the hills, Abram called Lot to meet with him on a ridge overlooking the valleys below. With the vast landscape stretching out before them, Abram spoke with a calm and generous heart. "Let there be no strife between you and me, and between your herdsmen and my herdsmen, for we are close relatives. Isn't the whole land before you? Let's part company. If you go to the left, I'll go to the right. If you go to the right, I'll go to the left." Lot looked out over the land, considering his options. To the east lay the lush plains of the Jordan Valley, where the grass was green and water flowed freely. It was a place that resembled Egypt in its fertility, stretching out toward the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. To the west, the hills of Canaan rose, rocky and less certain in their promise. Without much hesitation, Lot chose the fertile valley, pitching his tents near the city of Sodom. It seemed an obvious choice, a land that appeared to offer ease and prosperity. And so they parted ways, with Lot moving eastward, and Abram turning toward the less bountiful hills of Canaan. But as Lot set out with his herds, Abram stood watching the distant figure of his nephew disappear into the valley. He must have felt a mixture of sadness and hope, sadness in their separation, but hope in knowing that he was following a path that still aligned with God's promise, even if it meant taking the harder road. After Lot had gone, God spoke to Abram once more, renewing his promise. "Lift up your eyes and look from the place where you are, northward, southward, eastward, and westward. All the land that you see I will give to you and your offspring forever." God's words were like a balm to Abram's heart, reminding him that the promise wasn't tied to the most fertile lands, but to the faithfulness of the journey. The hills of Canaan, though less inviting than the valley, held a future shaped by divine hands. With renewed purpose, Abram moved his tents to the oaks of Mamre, near Hebron, where he built another altar to the Lord. There, amidst the rugged hills, Abram continued to trust that God's promises would unfold in their own time, even as Lot settled closer to the cities that would soon reveal their own troubles. And so, Abram's journey carried on, rooted in faith, undeterred by the uncertainties and separations that had marked his path thus far. He remained a man who sought peace over conflict, choosing the promise of God over the allure of easy prosperity. And little did he know, the decision to separate from Lot would soon bring even greater challenges and tests of faith his way. As time passed, Abram settled into the hills near Hebron, tending to his flocks and building altars to honor the God who had guided him. Meanwhile, Lot made a home for himself near the city of Sodom, where the fields were rich, but the shadows of its people's deeds grew darker each day. Word reached Abram from time to time of the increasing wickedness in those cities, Sodom and Gomorrah, a place where morality seemed to vanish as quickly as the morning mist. Yet life carried on, until one fateful evening when Abram received unexpected visitors. 3 travelers appeared near his tent, and Abram, ever hospitable, invited them in, offering food, water, and rest. As they ate under the shade of the trees, it became clear that these men were not ordinary travelers. One of them spoke, revealing the true nature of their visit. They were messengers from God, and they had come to investigate the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah, for the sins of these cities had reached the heavens. Abram's heart tightened with worry, not just for the cities, but for Lot, who now lived among those people. As the men prepared to leave, Abram walked with them a short distance, his mind racing. Then, Standing under the vast evening sky, he gathered his courage and spoke to the Lord who had accompanied these visitors. "Will you sweep away the righteous with the wicked?" he asked. "What if there are 50 righteous people in the city? Will you really sweep it away and not spare the place for the sake of the 50 righteous people in it?" The Lord listened, and Abram continued to plead, lowering the number again and again. 45, 40, 30, 20, and finally 10. Each time, God responded with patience and grace, agreeing that if even 10 righteous people could be found in the city, he would spare it. It was a bold conversation, a moment where Abram's compassion shone through. He knew the depths of Sodom's corruption, but he also believed in mercy. Perhaps it was hope for Lot's safety, or perhaps it was a hope that even a few good people could redeem a place so lost. And yet, deep down, Abram understood the weight of what was coming. As the messengers went on their way towards Sodom, Abram watched them disappear into the horizon, knowing that his prayers alone might not be enough to change what was destined. The night fell, thick and silent, and Abram stood in the darkness, wrestling with his thoughts. He could only imagine what might unfold in Sodom, hoping that somehow Lot would be spared from the judgment that seemed inevitable. Meanwhile, in Sodom, Lot welcomed the same mysterious visitors into his home, unaware of the danger about to descend on the city. The people of Sodom, consumed by their wickedness, surrounded Lot's house, demanding to harm the strangers. But the visitors revealed their true purpose, to rescue Lot and his family from the doom that would soon befall the city. As dawn approached, the visitors hurried Lot, his wife and daughters out of Sodom, urging them not to look back as fire and brimstone rained down from the sky, consuming everything in its path. The sky lit up with a terrible light, and the earth shook as the once thriving cities crumbled into ash. And though Lot and his daughters escaped, his wife, overcome with longing for the life they left behind, turned back and became a pillar of salt, frozen in the wake of her disobedience. From his place in the hills, Abram awoke to the sight of smoke rising like a furnace from the valley below. The destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah was a bitter reminder that even his prayers couldn't hold back the full force of divine judgment. He mourned for the cities lost to their sins and for Lot's family, scarred by the devastation they had witnessed. Yet, amidst the ashes, there was a small spark of hope. Lot had been spared, a remnant of the promise that had been woven through Abram's journey. And so, Abram remained, holding on to the belief that even in judgment, God's mercy could find a way, shaping the future that still lay ahead. As the smoke settled, Abram returned to his daily life, ever mindful of the balance between justice and mercy. He continued to watch over the land, knowing that his journey with God had not yet reached its end, and that more trials and promises still awaited him. Time passed, and life moved forward in the hills of Canaan. Yet, even with the echoes of Sodom and Gomorrah's destruction fading into the past, one constant remained in Abram and Sarai's life: the absence of a child. The promise of descendants as numerous as the stars still felt like a distant dream, especially as Sarai's age advanced. She carried the weight of this unfulfilled promise heavily, and each year without a child seemed to deepen that burden. One evening, Sarai came to Abram with a difficult proposal. "The Lord has kept me from having children," she said, her voice tinged with frustration and a lingering sadness. "Go, sleep with my servant Hagar. Perhaps I can build a family through her." It was an idea born from a place of desperation and longing, a plan that sought to fulfill God's promise through human means. Abram, trusting Sarai's wishes, agreed. Hagar, the Egyptian servant who had traveled with them from Egypt, became pregnant, and soon after, tensions in the household began to rise. The dynamic between Sarai and Hagar grew strained, and resentment took root. Sarai, once hopeful, now felt bitterness and jealousy toward the woman who carried Abram's child. When Hagar gave birth, the child was named Ishmael, and for a time it seemed that maybe, just maybe, this child would be the start of the promised nation. But deep in Abram's heart, he knew that this was not the child God had spoken of. Ishmael grew, and though Abram loved him as a father would, he sensed that the story was not yet complete. And then, many years later, when Abram was 99, God appeared to him again, and everything changed. The divine voice came with both a reminder and a revelation. I am God Almighty. Walk before me faithfully and be blameless. Then I will make my covenant between me and you and will greatly increase your numbers. This time, God spoke with clarity and renewed the promise in a way that Abram could no longer doubt. He renamed him Abraham, meaning father of many nations, and Sarai became Sarah. God assured Abraham that through Sarah, a son would be born, one who would carry the promise forward. But Abraham couldn't hide his disbelief. He fell face down, laughing at the impossibility of it all. Will a son be born to a man 100 years old? Will Sarah bear a child at the age of 90? He questioned. And yet, God's answer was unwavering. The child's name would be Isaac, meaning laughter, a reminder of the joy and surprise that would come with his birth. The promise was finally coming into focus, and it would happen not by human scheming, but by the power of the divine. Sure enough, as the seasons turned, Sarah conceived. Her laughter returned, not in disbelief but in joy, as she carried the child long awaited. And when Isaac was born, Abraham held in his arms the embodiment of a promise that had taken decades to fulfill. Sarah's laughter filled the tent as she declared, God has brought me laughter, and everyone who hears about this will laugh with me. But even with this joy, the story took another turn. The presence of Isaac brought tension between Sarah and Hagar to a breaking point. Sarah, protective of her own son's future, demanded that Hagar and Ishmael be sent away. Abraham's heart was heavy with sorrow. He loved Ishmael, his firstborn, but he knew that God's promise lay with Isaac. Reluctantly, he sent Hagar and Ishmael into the desert, trusting that God's care would follow them, even in the wilderness. And so, the family divided. Hagar and Ishmael found their own path, and God promised that Ishmael too would become the father of a great nation. But in the tents of Abraham, Isaac's laughter filled the air, a sign of hope and fulfillment. As the boy grew, Abraham's life took on a new rhythm, one marked by the joy of fatherhood in his old age. Isaac's presence was a daily reminder that God's promises, though slow to unfold, never failed. And yet, the journey of faith was far from over. The promise had taken shape, but Abraham sensed that there were still tests and challenges ahead. Challenges that would once again call upon his unwavering trust in the God who had led him from Ur, through Egypt, and to the hills of Canaan. In the quiet of those Canaanite nights, with Sarah beside him and Isaac asleep nearby, Abraham would look up at the stars, those same stars that once seemed impossibly distant. Now he could see a reflection of their promise in the eyes of his son, knowing that the story was not yet finished, but that it was well underway. As Isaac grew, Abraham's connection to God deepened, and with it came a new stage in their relationship, a covenant that would mark him and his descendants forever. One day, as Abraham walked through the quiet hills, the voice of God spoke to him again, but this time, it came with a command that would change the fabric of his family's identity. Walk before me faithfully and be blameless, God said, and then continued with words that resonated deeply with Abraham. This is my covenant with you and your descendants after you. Every male among you shall be circumcised. The covenant of circumcision was not just a physical act but a spiritual mark, a sign that Abraham and his descendants would belong to God's promise for all generations. The command must have seemed daunting, perhaps even strange, but Abraham didn't waver. He gathered his household, from the eldest servant to the youngest child, and explained to them the significance of this new covenant. It was a mark that set them apart, a sign of their special bond with the Creator who had led them from the uncertainty of Ur to the promise of Canaan. And so, on that day, Abraham took the step of obedience, circumcising every male in his household, including himself and Isaac, though still just a child. The pain of the act was real, but it was a physical reminder of a deeper reality, a promise that God's words would continue to shape their future. It was a covenant that spoke of belonging, of a people who would carry the name of God and the promise of a future nation in their very flesh. With this act, God reinforced the promise to Abraham. He spoke of Sarah again, affirming that she would be the mother of nations and that kings would come from her lineage. This promise wasn't just for a single generation but for generations upon generations, bound to Abraham through the covenant that marked them. The new names given to Abraham and Sarah carried weight too. Abraham, father of many nations, and Sarah, princess, both reflected the destiny God had planned for them. Each time they spoke these names, they would remember that their story was bigger than their own lives. It was a story that would shape the course of history. In the days that followed, Abraham felt the shift. He saw the way his household, his family, and even himself had been set apart. It was a quiet transformation, but it changed the way he saw his journey. He no longer wandered through Canaan as a stranger, but as the father of a people who would inherit the very land he walked upon. And yet, amidst this transformation, Abraham continued to care for the everyday needs of his household, knowing that the promises of God did not free him from the daily responsibilities of life. But now, each day felt like a step deeper into the mystery of God's plan. A plan that was unfolding through acts of faith, through moments of trust, and through the simple act of marking a covenant into the very fabric of his family. As the nights grew cooler and the stars seemed brighter, Abraham would hold Isaac close, feeling the presence of the promise in his son's laughter. He knew that the covenant of circumcision was not just about him. It was about Isaac and about the future that would follow. And so, as the stars filled the sky above, he continued to trust, knowing that their journey with God was far from over, and that the covenant, now sealed in flesh, would guide them through the challenges still to come. The years passed, and Isaac grew into a young boy, full of life and laughter, the embodiment of the promise that had once seemed so impossible. Abraham and Sarah found joy in watching him play among the hills of Canaan, and every day they were reminded of the miracle that God had brought into their lives. But just as Abraham began to feel the comfort of this new chapter, a command came from God that struck him like a lightning bolt. One morning, as the sun began to rise over the rugged hills, God spoke to Abraham again. But this time, the words were almost unbearable. "Take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you." The air seemed to grow still around Abraham. His heart must have pounded as he processed the command. How could this be? Isaac was the child of the promise, the one through whom God had said his descendants would be counted. And yet, here was God asking for the unthinkable. It was a test like no other, a test that reached into the deepest part of Abraham's faith. But Abraham did not argue, did not plead. He had spent years learning to trust the God who had led him through deserts, promised him a nation, and brought laughter into his home. He rose early the next morning, saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his servants and Isaac. Together, they set off for Moriah, a journey that lasted 3 long, silent days. Each step must have felt like a lifetime. As they neared the mountain, Abraham saw the place from a distance. He turned to his servants and said, "Stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you." His words, filled with a hope that defied the command he'd been given, were perhaps his way of clinging to the belief that somehow God would provide a way. Abraham and Isaac climbed the mountain together, with Isaac carrying the wood for the offering. As they ascended, Isaac broke the silence, his young voice filled with curiosity. "Father, the fire and wood are here, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham's reply was heavy with faith, even as his heart ached with the uncertainty of it all. "God himself will provide the lamb, my son." They reached the place God had shown him, and with trembling hands, Abraham built an altar. He arranged the wood, bound Isaac, and laid him on the altar. The scene must have been surreal. Isaac, the long-awaited son, lying atop the wood, and Abraham, the father who had hoped and prayed for him, now raising the knife. And then, just as the moment reached its most unbearable tension, a voice called out from the heavens, "Abraham, Abraham!" "Here I am," he replied, his voice breaking with emotion. "Do not lay a hand on the boy," the angel of the Lord said. "Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son." Abraham's hands shook as he lowered the knife. Tears filled his eyes as he looked into Isaac's face, and in that moment, he turned to see a ram caught by its horns in a nearby thicket. Relief washed over him as he understood that God had indeed provided. He took the ram and offered it as a burnt offering instead of his son. Abraham named the place Jehovah-Jireh, the Lord will provide, because in that place, God had made a way when no way seemed possible. It was a name that spoke of trust, of the faith that had carried him through this trial, and of a God who remained faithful even in the hardest of tests. Isaac, released from the altar, must have looked at his father with new eyes, seeing the depth of his faith. And Abraham, walking down the mountain with his son at his side, understood that this test was not about losing Isaac, but about revealing the depth of his trust in the God who had called him from Ur so many years ago. As they returned to their camp, Abraham knew that this moment would forever change the course of their journey. It was not just a test of obedience but a foreshadowing, a glimpse into the mysterious ways of God, who would one day provide another sacrifice, another lamb, to fulfill a promise that stretched beyond Abraham's lifetime. Back among the oaks of Mamre, the routine of life resumed, but Abraham carried with him the knowledge that he had faced the ultimate test and seen God's faithfulness up close. The promise remained alive, woven into every breath Isaac took, and Abraham knew that no matter what trials lay ahead, the God who had provided the ram would continue to guide their steps through the unknown future. After the events on Mount Moriah, life gradually settled back into its rhythms, but the significance of that moment never left Abraham or Isaac. The bond between them was deeper now, bound not just by blood, but by an encounter with God's mercy that neither would ever forget. Isaac grew stronger, and with each passing year, the promises of God felt closer, more tangible, even as the shadows of age began to touch Abraham and Sarah. And then came a time of sorrow, a time when the laughter that had filled their tent for so many years began to fade. Sarah, the woman who had journeyed from Ur to Canaan, who had shared the promises and the struggles, breathed her last at the age of 127. Her death struck Abraham with a grief that cut deep, a loss that lingered like a shadow over the camp. They had shared a lifetime together, from the hope of Isaac's birth to the trials of their wandering, and now she was gone. Abraham mourned for her, weeping beside her lifeless form, but he knew that there was still work to be done. He was a stranger in the land of Canaan, and he needed a place to bury his beloved wife, a place that would become a permanent marker of their presence in the land promised to them. So he approached the Hittites, the people who lived in that region, seeking to purchase a burial site. With humility and respect, he spoke to them, acknowledging his status as a foreigner in their land. "I am a foreigner and stranger among you. Sell me some property for a burial site here, so I can bury my dead." The Hittites, recognizing Abraham's status as a respected man of God, offered him the land freely, saying, "Hear us, my lord. You are a mighty prince among us. Bury your dead in the choicest of our tombs." But Abraham insisted on paying the full price, refusing to accept a gift for what would become a resting place for Sarah and, eventually, himself. He chose the cave of Machpelah, owned by Ephron the Hittite. After a respectful negotiation, Abraham purchased the cave along with the surrounding field, paying the agreed price in silver. It was the first piece of land he would own in Canaan, a small plot but one that held great significance. It was more than a burial site. It was a symbol that, even in death, the promise of God's gift of the land remained alive. It was a place that spoke of roots being planted in a land that would one day belong to Abraham's descendants. Abraham buried Sarah in the cave of Machpelah, near Mamre, where they had lived for so many years. He laid her to rest in the land of promise, a land that was slowly becoming his by the faith that had carried them there. And though the sorrow of loss weighed heavily on him, the cave stood as a reminder that God's promises would extend beyond his own lifetime. As the days passed, Abraham knew that his own time would eventually come, but he looked upon Isaac, seeing in him the continuation of the promise that had been made so long ago. He knew that the story of their family, the story of the promise, was far from over. There were still chapters to be written, generations yet to be born, all carrying the mark of God's covenant with him. And so, Abraham turned his focus to securing a future for Isaac, knowing that the legacy of the promise depended on the next steps. He called his most trusted servant, tasking him with a mission to find a wife for Isaac, not among the Canaanites, but from his own people, from the land of his family. It was a mission that carried the weight of generations, a task that would ensure that the line of promise would continue through Isaac, as God had intended. Abraham watched as his servant departed, carrying with him the hopes of a future that would unfold long after his own footsteps had faded from the earth. He knew that the God who had been faithful through every trial, who had provided a ram on Mount Moriah and comfort in the shadow of Sarah's loss, would continue to guide Isaac and his descendants. And so, in the twilight of his life, Abraham stood by the cave of Machpelah, where Sarah rested, looking out over the hills of Canaan. He saw not just a landscape, but a promise, a land that would one day be filled with his children, their children, and the children that would follow. It was a vision that stretched beyond the horizon, a testament to the faith that had carried him from Ur to this place of beginnings and endings. The story of Abraham was winding down, but the story of the promise was just beginning, ready to pass into the hands of Isaac, the child of laughter, who would carry it forward into the unknown future. As Abraham stood on the hills near the cave of Machpelah, reflecting on the passage of time and the legacy he was building, his thoughts often turned to Isaac. The boy, now a grown man, was the living embodiment of all the promises God had made, a bridge between the past and the future. But Abraham knew that Isaac's journey was only beginning, and for the promise to continue, Isaac needed a partner, a wife who would share in the covenant and help build the next chapter of their family. So, Abraham called upon his most trusted servant, a man who had been with him for many years, witnessing both the highs and lows of his master's journey. Abraham placed his hand under the servant's thigh, a solemn and ancient gesture, and made him swear an oath. "You shall not take a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites, among whom I dwell," Abraham instructed, his voice firm with the weight of the task. "But go to my country and to my kindred, and take a wife for my son Isaac." The servant, loyal and determined, set out on his journey, carrying gifts and provisions for the trip. He traveled far, back to the land where Abraham's story had first begun, back to the distant lands of Mesopotamia, where Abraham's family still lived. As he neared the town of Nahor, the servant knew that his mission was about more than just finding a bride. It was about seeking God's guidance in the continuation of Abraham's legacy. Arriving at a well outside the town, he paused, the heat of the day settling around him. There, he prayed for a sign, a way to recognize the woman whom God had chosen for Isaac. "O Lord, God of my master Abraham," he prayed, "please grant me success today and show steadfast love to my master. Let the young woman to whom I say, 'Please let down your jar that I may drink,' and who replies, 'Drink, and I will water your camels also,' be the one you have appointed for your servant Isaac." Before he had even finished speaking, a young woman named Rebekah approached the well, carrying a jar on her shoulder. She was beautiful, kind, and generous, traits that would soon reveal her suitability for the promise. When the servant asked her for a drink, she responded just as he had prayed, "Drink, my lord," and then, without hesitation, she offered to draw water for his camels as well. In that moment, the servant knew his prayer had been answered. He gave Rebekah gifts, a gold ring and bracelets, and asked about her family, discovering that she was the granddaughter of Nahor, Abraham's brother. With joy in his heart, the servant bowed down and worshipped the Lord, thanking him for guiding him to the right place, to the right person, and for showing kindness to Abraham and his house. Rebekah ran to her family to tell them of the stranger at the well and the gifts he had given her. Her brother Laban welcomed the servant into their home, offering food and lodging. But the servant, eager to fulfill his mission, refused to eat until he had told them the purpose of his journey. He spoke of Abraham, the promises God had made, and the task he had been given to find a wife for Isaac. Rebekah's family listened, and seeing God's hand in the events, they agreed that this was his will. Rebekah herself, when asked, expressed her willingness to leave her home and travel to a distant land to become Isaac's wife. And so, with blessings from her family, Rebekah set out with the servant, carrying with her the hopes and prayers of her loved ones. As they journeyed back to Canaan, the sun dipped low in the sky, casting long shadows over the land. Rebekah rode forward with curiosity and a bit of nervousness about the life that awaited her. And as they drew near, she looked out and saw a man walking in the fields, meditating in the cool of the evening. It was Isaac, and when he lifted his eyes and saw the approaching caravan, his heart must have quickened. Rebekah dismounted, veiling herself in respect, and met Isaac for the first time. In that quiet moment, under the endless sky, something new began. A connection, a bond that would carry forward the story that Abraham had begun. Isaac took Rebekah into his mother Sarah's tent, and there, she became his wife. He loved her deeply, and she brought comfort to his heart after the loss of his mother. It was a new beginning for both of them, a continuation of the promise that God had made to Abraham so many years before. And so, in those fields of Canaan, the promise took root in a new generation. Abraham, from a distance, watched the joy between Isaac and Rebekah and knew that his journey, filled with tests, trials, and triumphs, had been worth every step. He saw in them the unfolding of God's words, a future that stretched far beyond the hills and valleys of Canaan. In his old age, Abraham's heart found peace. He knew that the God who had called him from Ur, who had provided in the wilderness and tested him on Mount Moriah, would continue to guide Isaac and Rebekah. The story of their family was now intertwined with the divine, and the covenant would endure through time, through challenges yet to come, until the stars in the sky truly became too numerous to count. As the last years of his life passed, Abraham could rest, knowing that his faith had laid the foundation for a nation. He had seen the promise in the laughter of a child and the love of a son for his wife. And with that, he closed his eyes, trusting that the God who had been faithful to him would remain faithful to those who followed. Abraham's story came to an end, but the promise he believed in continued on, carried by Isaac, Rebekah, and the generations that would rise from their union. And in that quiet land of Canaan, beneath the sky that had witnessed so much, the story of a promise that would reach across the ages remained alive, a legacy of faith and hope that would echo through time.